G'day everyone, this is the top 10 AFL Grand Final countdown, talking about Grand Finals in the AFL era, strictly 1990 onwards. Choosing my best 10, we are up to number 8. And this one, bit of a heartbreaker I'm afraid for Collingwood fans, and triumph for Brisbane fans. Yes, I'm talking about 2002 and the Brisbane Lions' second consecutive premiership, won in the end by a very narrow 9 points over the Pies. And this game, very, very close to producing arguably the biggest grand final upset of all time. Certainly would have been on a par with Collingwood's famous upset of Melbourne when the Demons were going for 4 flags in a row back in 1958. That's how far apart these two sides were viewed as being. Brisbane, in its run of 4 years of grand final appearances and 3 flags in a row, they never played better football than in the year of 2002. They were absolutely dominant. Still didn't finish on top, strangely enough. That went to Port Adelaide, but the Lions very close behind the power. And all their stars were at the peak of their careers at this stage. They were relatively injury-free as opposed to the following season. And they would finish second on the ladder with 17 wins. Collingwood, meanwhile, certainly plucky, certainly brave under Mick Malthouse, but in terms of raw talent, not necessarily one of the best handful of teams in the competition, ended up grabbing 4th spot, which sent them over to Adelaide to play against the ladder leaders, Port Adelaide, and this produced a famous finals upset. Collingwood, which had finished 5 wins behind the power, famously upsetting Port at home, catapulting themselves into a preliminary final, which they would win on home turf against Adelaide. So the Pies back in the grand final. Brisbane, meanwhile, just taking all before them. They smashed Adelaide in a thumping qualifying final win, and then dispensed with Port Adelaide up at the Gabba in a massive preliminary final win. So they couldn't have been better prepared, and they were hot favourites indeed going into this game. What you couldn't have counted on was a very bad day weather-wise, though. It was pretty wet and cold, incredibly cold. I remember this game, and not very pleasant conditions at all. However, probably ones which suited Collingwood, certainly in terms of dragging a more talented side back to their level and giving them a chance to scrap it out, which they did particularly well in that era under Mick Malthouse. And thus began an epic arm wrestle with never any more than a kick and a half separating these two teams for the entire game. In fact, the final margin of 9 points was the biggest margin of the entire game, incredibly. Goals very hard to come by early on. In fact, only 1 kicked in the entire first quarter. That was by Anthony Rocca for the Pies. Brisbane working themselves back into the game in that second term where their class really started to show. Sean Hart broke the drought for them on the goal-scoring front. Alistair Lynch really dominant up forward. And in fact, he and Anthony Rocca for the Pies, outstanding games from both of them, each ending up with 4 goals in very, very difficult conditions for marking forwards. The Pies looked like they stole a bit of a mini break with goals to Rocca and Josh Fraser, who also played pretty well in attack for them. And they were up by 8 points, but a couple of crucial late goals just on halftime made the difference. 8 points to Brisbane going into the long break. I think a lot of people at that stage were thinking the Lions would gradually pull away and win comfortably, but Collingwood wouldn't be denied in this game, and they were terrific again in the third quarter. The third term producing probably the best football of this game, 4 goals to either side. Nathan Buckley kicking an absolute cracker for Collingwood from the outer side wing. He played a fantastic game this day, and ended up, of course, winning the Norm Smith medal. However, every time Collingwood looked like they might be able to do the seemingly impossible, Brisbane found an answer. They did it again in the third term with late goals to Brown and Voss, and it was they who led going into the last change by just 4 points. Goal for goal struggle again in the last term. Josh Fraser's third goal of the game, gave Collingwood the lead as late as the 11-minute mark, and an amazing upset still very much on the cards. Brisbane, though, found another goal out of Alistair Lynch up forward. It was then a real scramble. Michael Voss coming to the fore. He really controlled a lot of the game in that last 10 or 15 minutes. Nathan Buckley, similarly brilliant for the Pies. And so Brisbane leading by the narrowest of margins, or by 3 points at least, after a point to Jason Ackermanis. He would follow up with definitely the most crucial goal of his entire career. A goalmouth scramble. He read it beautifully off the pack, snapped over his shoulder, and after what seemed like an eternity, the goal umpire signalled full points. That gave Brisbane a 9-point margin with just under 5 minutes to play, and indeed that would be the last score for the game. Michael Voss, like I said, in those closing couple of minutes, just incredible leadership for the Lions, taking a couple of really courageous marks, slowing the game down, just controlling the play and making sure that Brisbane hung on to that lead. Heartbreak for the Pies when the siren finally went. They had given this everything, and Mick Malthouse has acknowledged this team as one of his favourite ever teams to coach. Not necessarily overly stocked with talent, but gee, they had some tries. Guys who we've probably forgotten about to a large degree about 20 or so years later, but the likes of Rupert Betheris, Steve McKee, Carl Steinfort, Ryan Loney, these guys all did every little bit they could to get Collingwood to what would have been an amazing flag triumph. Of course, these two sides would meet again the following season in the grand final, and on that day, Collingwood would actually go into the game favourites, Brisbane carrying a truckload of injuries. We all know what happened in that one. Brisbane pulled out a sensational performance and stunned the Pies and managed to win that one pretty comfortably. Not this one, though, the game in which they did go in, a very hot favourite. Like I said, it would have been one of the biggest, if not the biggest, grand final upset of all time, and the Pies very nearly pulled it off. If nothing else, this was an absolute nail-biter. The margin, little more than a kick for the entire day in difficult conditions, fingernails bitten down to the quick by fans of both sides before Brisbane finally prevailed. Their second flag in a row, of course, they'd make it 3 and end up playing off for the right to win 4 flags in a row, which would have equalled Collingwood's effort between 1927 and 1930. They're an amazing side, the Lions of the early 2000s, but they really had their hands full this day with a very plucky challenger. And that was the story of 2002. Another great grand final in this list. We've been blessed with some rippers, certainly since the turn of the millennium. I'll be back to talk to you about number 7 in this countdown very soon.